Quit school when she was 17. Senator on TV calls her welfare queen. Used to be daddy's little girl. Now she needs help in this mean old world.
Hello everybody, welcome to another AP European History SIGcast, live and in color here from Keystone Oaks High School. In this episode, we're going to continue our journey through post-World War II Europe and the Cold War and analyze the United States and Soviet economic plans for peace and stability, as well as the development of something that we will call the welfare state in Western Europe and the United States. So we start out with post-World War II economic troubles. Let's face it, Europe was essentially annihilated after World War II. All right, just devastated. And, you throw on top of some of the places weren't totally rebuilt after World War I. And economists and governments struggled to devise a plan for recovery. Now, again, everybody knew they needed to avoid repeating the past. They needed a clear-cut plan for recovery. They couldn't have crippling reparations like was issued and against Germany after the Treaty of Versailles and after World War I. They wanted to avoid that whole mess. In fact, that's why World War II, in many cases, happened, and Europe went down that path. Many governments maintained a wartime economy afterwards, controlling prices, maintaining tariffs and quotas to protect their home industry. But this doesn't really work in peacetime. Governments controlling production and prices is really a centrally planned economy, much like the USSR. So, again, the USSR, the communists, they're going to want to continue that, that particular tactic. However, the Western countries don't really want to go down that route. All right. And as European economies failed to pick up following World War II, we see some things happen here that freak people out in the West. For example, the Popular Front parties became, again, back in the mainstream and became far more popular. And people in the United States and some of the capitalists and the conservatives in all these European countries feared that these people were going to take office, align each of these countries with the Soviet Union. And so, as I mentioned, at home, the United States is going through kind of what we call a second Red Scare. The feeling is we need to do something to make sure communism didn't spread, because if we don't, it's going to spread to the United States. We're going to lose our private property. We're going to lose our individualism, and all of those things are factors here. Now, it should be noted that Britain and France were particularly under pressure from socialists and communists to reform. Part of it is because of their proximity to some of these Soviet or these socialist and communist ideas, being right that they're in the continent of Europe. And so, people realize that, if these things catch on, people are really toying with the idea of overthrowing these republics, overthrowing the government. There was unrest. An example is Churchill was voted out of office as prime minister, despite winning World War II and showing just one of the best leaders of all time in European history. He was voted out in favor of the Labour Party candidate, Clement Attlee, who was in prime minister from 1945 to 1951. And basically what people wanted was the government to actually take a little bit more of a direct course and involvement in their life. They started to provide programs and relief to keep people happy. Now again, don't go political on me right now, but again, their goal was that, we got to keep people happy, and ultimately we got to avoid World War III. And how did World War I, how did World War II start? You have this unrest. Happy people don't revolt. So, they're taking some of the things that have gone on in England over the last 100 years, the Chartist movement, getting people more of a voice, and they're listening. Okay. Now again, it's not going to work in the long run. There's going to be some problems to this development of the welfare state, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But the fact that some of these leftist candidates are having success and winning, again, America is forced to kind of do something about this. And what we see here is Uniontown's own former American General George Marshall, who is now serving as Secretary of State, devised an American aid program designed to provide money for recovery and strengthen Europe against communism. It's called the Economic Recovery Act. And here you have an example depicting what people, conservatives in France and people in the United States saw the French Popular Front as being Soviet puppets. That's the perspective. But this Economic Recovery Act is dubbed the Marshall Plan, and you need to know it on the AP test. And in this, the United States provides billions of dollars to any European and actually some Asian countries that are willing to accept it. It was intended to rebuild stability and prosperity in Europe and other countries. $13 billion for economic recovery. It did exclude the Soviet Union. But the underlying belief was that communism fed off the economic turmoil. So the Marshall Plan pushed Stalin to safeguard Soviet interests more enthusiastically. To him, it was a direct threat to Stalin. We didn't offer it to him. We did offer it to him, I should say, but we knew what his answer would be. Okay? And again, like I said, we offered it to him. That may surprise you, but there was a catch. In order to accept funds, countries, including the Soviet Union, were required to adopt free market principles, eliminate wartime tariffs, quotas, and price controls. And to the Soviets, this was a slap in the face because that was the whole basis and the foundation of their communist government. So you add the Marshall Plan, $13 billion, to what we gave Greece and Turkey in 1947, $400 million. We are spending a lot of money for this. So with trade barriers reduced and market economies allowed to function, Europeans were able to produce and spend more. And what did they spend more money on? Well, it benefited the United States because they were buying mostly at this time American goods. Remember, we didn't have to rebuild. Our factories were at full production. So the United States profited greatly as well in this little transaction. We lent them money. They bought our consumer goods. They bought things like appliances, dishwashers, and the consumer goods that were kind of luxurious, that hadn't been available to them prior to the war. And we also gave them rock and roll in the 1950s. So while behind the Iron Curtain, what are they doing? They're still reeling from rebuilding. In Germany, East Germany in particular, the Soviets had removed most of the industrial capacity by disassembling their factories and moving them into Russia. In the West, people had jobs. People were employed. People had money. They had extra money to buy in consumer goods. In the eastern part, they were starving and struggling to find work. This is dubbed the Marshall Plan as the economic miracle. That might be something that you can use on outside information if this comes up in the form of a DBQ. But you can see, the countries that we offered aid to. And, this is a box of early on the Cold War score. And you can see, if you pause the video, you can kind of see what we feel that the communists have lost and gained and what the United States and its allies had lost and gained. It's kind of interesting perspective. This is a Marshall Plan cartoon, economic recovery program, and it has all the countries that are accepting aid, full speed ahead. The economy is rolling. You see the Europa here. And then milk, the new weapon of democracy. Again, these countries were buying things like milk, and our farms were providing a lot of the economic basis and foundation for the economic recovery. So they're doing better. We're doing better. Here's another interesting thing. Without the Marshall Plan, your bread would be bare, and so would your children. So again, some propaganda here. This is kind of an interesting take of, you can see what countries took the most aid, and by far it was Britain and France, but all these other countries, including Italy, were not too far behind. I like this picture. It says, can he block it? The United States, here comes the Marshall Plan, European recovery going towards the hoop. Can Stalin block it? What's he going to do to block it? We'll talk about that in a second. And here's kind of an interesting cartoon. Here's George C. Marshall on his tractor. And again, behind this wall, you hear, this is obviously Western Europe. Here's Eastern Europe. It's the same thing without the mechanical problems. It says, and if you look here, this is the Soviet tractor, the Marshall-Stalin plan, not Marshall Plan. And you can see people looking over here at what's going on in Western Europe. So good political cartoon there. All right, so to counter this, what are the Soviets going to do? To provide counter-aid program for the East, the Soviet formed Comecon, all right, C-O-M-E-C-O-N, an aid program for Eastern Europe to rebuild Eastern Europe, much like this Marshall Plan. But to the Soviets, of course, they made sure none of the Eastern governments accepted any aid from the United States and the West. So they weren't allowed to take Marshall aid and forced them to take Soviet grants and loans. And like the Americans, the Soviet used this opportunity to make other Europeans and the other European countries become indebted to them. And again, they had to purchase goods from the Soviet Union. So again, a little bit similar in their response. As a result, the Soviet Union solidified its position and influence in the East. These countries were loyal, dead loyal to the Soviet Union, while we had American unity and consumerism developing in the West. They were gravitating towards the United States, not just militarily like in NATO, but with the Marshall Plan, they were economically tied at the hip with the United States. A very, very economically polarized world, as well as politically and militarily. Now, not only were there two sides divided militaristically, as I said, in NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but economically. Kind of repeated myself there, but I just want to drive that point home. So socialist parties after World War II will see kind of a resurgence, as you can see by this ribbon here, Vote Labor. In an attempt to placate socialists and communists in Western Europe, one of the things that Western governments began to do was to beat them at their own game. All right, what they did was they adopted large-scale social programs for aid. We saw this little synthesis with what Bismarck tried to do to keep people from voting for socialists. He gave them Social Security. He gave them unemployment insurance and things of that nature. This was an attempt to thwart their infiltration. So governments kind of morph what they're doing and evolve. While the economic miracle had certainly helped economies recover, working conditions and wages and benefits were far below what people desired and wanted. So following World War II, unions and socialist parties in Western Europe will start to gain support and become mainstream with voters, even voters in the middle class. And many seats in the various parliaments, including England and France, unions and these labor movements were actually gaining seats. In the United States, a lot of times what the conservatives would do here as well as in these Western countries, they would try to portray unions as communist, and this still happens a little bit today. But in Britain, a good example of this is the Labour Party. They remained a dominant pro-leftist socialist force. And I've already talked about Clement Attlee actually replacing Churchill in 1945 at Potsdam, and he was in power until 1951. In France, the French Socialist Party, along with other socialist smaller parties, played a large role in founding social programs in France. They had a national car called Renault, and we had one of those. You have to ask me about that. The work weeks were shortened to 40 hours. They were granted paid vacations. Guaranteed minimum wages were established, and the coal and steel industries were nationalized and controlled by the federal government. There were some people in the United States that were calling for this as well. So as these leftist parties gained more power in government, they began to develop what is called the cradle-to-grave welfare programs, where the government would take care of people from the cradle to grave. They offered Social Security, unemployment insurance, workman's comp, health care, free health care, medical insurance. All right? Again, I don't say free. You still have to pay for it with taxes. But the fundamental role of the state had changed and grew exponentially after World War II as to one of being protectors of its citizens, not getting out of the way and laissez-faire, particularly to those countries in need. So again, this is the whole cradle-to-grave mentality. This meant that governments were increasingly responsible for the well-being, health, and lives of the citizens. With labor and socialist parties in power, more and more lifelong entitlement and programs began to be implemented all over Europe. To pay for these programs, taxes were increased heavily and massively across Europe, resulting in the exiting of many production-based jobs. All right, they went to more white-collar. The factories went to Asia and other places where it was cheaper. There was stagnant growth and rising national debt. Stay tuned for stagflation, and the result, this is a conservative resurgence in the late 70s and early 80s. But from the 50s onward into the 60s, we associate this with the cradle-to-grave era or the welfare state. If you have any questions, please make sure you write them down in your notebook. We'll address them in class.
Music, watch the baby dance to the welfare music. Will she ever stand a chance?